Hi there, combat sports fans. My name is Josh, and welcome to the first ever episode of your newest and hopefully soon to be favourite podcast focusing on martial arts and their practitioners, Dialectic of Violence. Before I get into the real content that you're here for, might as well mention a little bit about myself so you know who's doing all this yapping and decide whether you should care. As you may tell by my accent, I'm from New Zealand. I've been a lifelong hobbyist in martial arts and trained on and off in boxing, Muay Thai, Judo, Greco-Roman and freestyle wrestling, and mixed martial arts. In the interest of full transparency, I'll let you know that I didn't compete in any of these at a professional level. I have an interest in all martial arts, although like most people, not all of them to the same degree. My favourite combat sports to watch are mixed martial arts, followed by boxing and kickboxing, then wrestling and judo. I can appreciate the skill of high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but I'm not going to sit here and lie to you, claiming that I stay up for days cheesing for the ADCCs. I've been an avid mixed martial arts fan since 2010, and analysis of the sport is of particular interest to me. At the end of the pod, I'll be giving shout out to some more well-known channels on YouTube and elsewhere, which you'll likely already be aware of if the almighty algorithm sent you to me, but nevertheless, if you have missed them, please check them out also. So, what does the name of the podcast mean? Well, Webster's defines dialectic as, no, don't worry, I'm not doing that. In simple terms, a dialectic is the art of finding a truth through the collision of different viewpoints or methodologies. Either one comes out on top, or a synthesis is made between the two. In a sense, all competition is dialectical, and we see dialectics at work all the time in fighting. Whereas the classic MMA striker vs grappler matchup, the brawler boxer outfighter pairings in boxing, or just generally the way different individuals' attributes, skills, tactics, and strategy all contribute to determining who comes out on top in a fight. So to illustrate an example of how these concepts work in practice, and because he's really fun to watch and to talk about, this channel's first video is going to be about former UFC light heavyweight champion and, at the time of recording, number 2 ranked contender and all-around oddball in that division, Jiri Prochazka. Jiri grew up in the South Moravian village of Hostararitsa in southeast Czechia. Some Czech sources seem to report that his father passed away when he was 6. He was very active in his youth and as an adolescent got involved with street fighting related to the local hooligan club, which was tied to FC Zbrojovka Brno. He first encountered MMA as a teen, the same way many of us did, a friend showing cool videos of Mirko Krokop and Fedor knocking people the hell out. After watching the B-movie Never Back Down, he began training in martial arts, specifically Muay Thai. Will watching Never Back Down turn you into a machine of destruction akin to Jiri Prochazka? Maybe. But it has a 22% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, stars Amber Heard, and doesn't have Michael Jai White in it like its sequel, so ask yourself, is it really worth it? At 20 years old, Jiri started his professional MMA career with local promotion Gladiator Fighting Championship. In just over 3.5 years, he compiled a record of 14-2-1 and was signed to Japanese promotion Rizin. Debuting for Rizin in the 2015 Heavyweight Grand Prix, he defeated Japanese veteran Satoshi Ishii in a minute and a half with a head kick and follow-up knees. In the semi-final, Prochazka forced Vadim Nemkov to retire at the end of the first round, which in Rizin is 10 minutes long. And in the final of the tournament, the 23-year-old Prochazka was knocked out by Muhammad King Mo Lawal. After this loss, Prochazka would go down to light heavyweight and would be undefeated in 9 more fights for the Japanese promotion, achieving first-round knockouts in 8 of them. Among these 9 victims was King Mo in a rematch, Bruno Capolozza, who would go on to become the 2021 PFL Heavyweight World Champion, Karl Albrechtsen, one of the best light heavyweights outside the UFC, who himself has wins over Vadim Nemkov's brother Viktor, and current PFL Light Heavyweight Champion Dobletjan Yagjimuradov, as well as former UFC fighters Fabio Maldonado and CB Dollaway. In July 2020, Prochazka would make his UFC debut against light heavyweight title challenger Volkan Oezdemir, becoming only the second man to finish Oezdemir with strikes. The first was Daniel Cormier, who got Oezdemir in a crucifix position and gave the referee no option but to stop the fight. Unlike Cormier, Prochazka put Oezdemir out cold. At the time of recording, he's the only man to do so to the tough Swiss striker. Prochazka would next fight in May of the following year, headlining a UFC on ESPN Fight Night against another title challenger, Dominic Reyes, knocking him out by spinning elbow in round 2 of an action-packed back-and-forth war. If you haven't watched it, go watch it. The incredible fight and the highlights produced catapulted Prochazka to a chance at the title against Glover Teixeira in June 2022. Another bout characterized by extreme violence and constant changes in the flow and initiative of the fight, the younger challenger would outlast the veteran champion and become the only fighter to submit Teixeira. Again, if you haven't seen it, watch that fight. Vacating the belt due to injury, Prochazka would come back to the cage in November 2023 against Alex Pereira. After leading in the first round and stunning the former Glory Kickboxing 2 Division champion on multiple occasions, an overzealous pursuit would see Prochazka fall victim to Pereira's famous short left hook which floored the Czech fighter. After a desperation shot by Prochazka and some elbow from the Brazilian, the referee would intervene and Prochazka experienced his first loss in the UFC. Bouncing back in a come-from-behind performance to defeat Austrian Serb contender Alexander Rakic in April 2024 at UFC 300, headlined by Pereira's first title defense against another vacated champion Jamal Hill, Pereira and Prochazka would rematch in short notice at UFC 303 in June 2024. Unlike the competitive first fight, this was a rout. Prochazka was floored by a left hook counter from the Brazilian champion at the very last seconds of round 1 and would be finished with a head kick and follow-up punches from Pereira at the beginning of round 2. Determined to make some adjustments to his style to improve his chances against Pereira if he ever got another chance at fighting the Brazilian star, Prochazka would show off his improvements at UFC 311, defeating Jamal Hill by third round TKO and knocking his American opponent down in both the first and third rounds. It is the discourse around Jiri Prochazka and his style, both in the build-up to and the aftermath of his bout with Jamal Hill, which inspired me to create this video and finally start this channel. I noticed that amongst many of the talking heads around the sport, it suddenly became fashionable after Jiri's second loss to Pereira to say that he has no defense, or that he's a bad fighter whose successes have come only due to aggression or even blind luck. In the aftermath of the win over Hill, these views have not been rescinded, but rather most of these commentators then say, oh, now he has head movement, now there's defense. In contrast, I'm of the opinion that this defensive system has always been a key part of Prochazka's overall style, not a new addition. Sure, there have been improvements, maybe he's tidied it up here and there, and a few flourishes added on, maybe some more proactive counterpunching, but overall, the skeleton of that system was there beforehand. It also led me to the opinion that most of the commentators around the sport simply don't get the unorthodox style of Jiri Prochazka. It's something a bit different than what people are used to seeing, and so I'll do my best here to disentangle what makes Jiri Prochazka's style such a nightmare for pretty much everyone that isn't Alex Pereira. Welcome again to Dialectic of Violence. Let's start with something pretty much everyone who knows who Jiri Prochazka is should be already aware of. The man's clearly an enthusiast of classical Japanese culture. On several occasions, Prochazka has gone on long diatribes in broken English about the importance of Bushido principles in his life and the influence of the seminal work of 16th century Japanese duelist and default name for your local sushi restaurant, Musashi. Miyamoto Musashi was a master swordsman and a pioneer of a style known as Niten no Ichiryu, which can be translated to 2 heavens, 1 school, or 2 swords, 1 spirit. Though seem a little bit different, it's because classical Japanese writers love using homophones and double meanings, so there you are. To make it even more clever, or at least so that he knows that you know that he's clever, the name's also a reference to the 2 guardians of the Buddha according to a particular sutra. I'm not a Buddhist, don't know what it is, not going to go into it. Musashi held the record for the most undefeated duels in Japanese history with 62, so he must have been doing something right. As the name suggests, the Niten no Ichiryu school was unusual in Japanese swordsmanship for dual wielding, both a long katana sword and a shorter companion sword known as a wakizashi. Why is any of this trivia important? Well, because in many ways I think Jiri Prochazka's approach to mixed martial arts has been based on attempting to apply the principles of the Niten no Ichiryu methodology to unarmed combat, and then augmenting this approach with elements of other martial arts, mostly karate and a little bit of Muay Thai, to round out his game. So how can a manual on sword fighting be relevant to a sport of unarmed combat? Well, most people would tell you that it isn't. And while I'm not here to make the case that any newcomers to martial arts should privilege Musashi's lessons on sword fighting over the foundational principles of more proven unarmed combat styles, there's ways in which the basic concepts of the Niten no Ichiryu school of sword fighting can be translated to mixed martial arts, if you get really sort of ornate about it. The difference between dueling with a sword and unarmed fighting is so obvious that it's only worth outlining them here to emphasize the differences between the Niten no Ichiryu methods and the more conservative forms of sword fighting. We've all seen some media, whether film, anime, documentaries, etc., that show a duel between Japanese swordsmen. Typically, they're standing in a relatively static stance, both hands on the grip of their sword. No one strikes like this in unarmed combat. By contrast, Musashi would wield 2 swords in battle, in contrast to the traditional style that is. In a fight, you have 2 hands, both of which are legitimate and dangerous weapons. Musashi would wield a shorter wakizashi alongside his longer katana, just like a striker will have a lead and a rear hand. The front hand closer to the opponent and typically easier to land, the rear hand typically more impactful. The traditional Japanese dueling style would not involve wearing armor, unlike a samurai who would on the battlefield, and as such, in a dueling setting, all contact is potentially fatal. This ensures that initiative is incredibly important. If the opponent blocks with their sword, they're momentarily unable to attack, potentially giving a free opportunity for the attacker to get in another hit. As such, positioning and footwork are key to preventing damage without surrendering initiative. In fact, a missed attack typically leaves an opponent wide open, as is also the case when striking in MMA. If we imagine these ideas as a chain of preference, the best case is avoidance, second best is parrying or redirection, and third is blocking. We can see this chain of preference in Jiri Prochazka's actions in his fights, which we'll explore soon. Further aspects of his fighting style are directly derived from Miyamoto Musashi's most famous work, The Book of Five Rings, which I'm going to explore just briefly in a second. The Book of Five Rings is itself separated into 5 sections, each outlining different aspects of martial arts both in preparation and in action, and are named after 5 Buddhist elemental forces: Earth, Water, Fire, Wind, and the Void. The Book of Earth serves as an introduction to several weapons, funnily enough claiming that the best weapon is a gun, so I guess at least this isn't some chi focusing Hadouken bullshito nonsense. The Book of Earth also lays out the importance of proficiency in all forms of fighting, a principle that will seem very familiar to modern mixed martial artists or fans of the sport. A number of principles for conscientious training are also laid out, which I won't go into detail here. The Book of Earth can be seen as laying out foundational principles, as the earth is the foundation, of course, upon which all else is built. The Book of Water emphasizes flexibility, fluidity, and balance. Key aspects outlined in this section include a rejection of overemphasis on one weapon, so variety, something we're very familiar with in mixed martial arts, the need for calmness and poise during battle, the importance of perception and constantly taking in information about the changing circumstances of battle, and also outlines correct stance, which in his opinion was basically the stance we see Jiri use, which is a sort of wide stance with a sort of erect head most of the time, aside from when he's actually pulling away from stuff. The Book of Fire outlines strategies and tactics to use in battle. In this section, positioning, feinting, and deception are emphasized, as well as the appropriate use of aggression and initiative. In the Book of Fire, Musashi insists that the most important part of fighting is timing and rhythm, something that anyone with any real understanding of striking would no doubt agree with. Funnily enough, the Book of Wind is basically a diss to other schools of martial arts, although he does note that all martial arts built off of information from prior schools, which is something that Musashi himself did, as both his father and grandfather taught dueling skills, and Musashi no doubt, built upon their styles and the formulation of his own. The Book of Void's more esoteric and is built upon Zen Buddhist concepts. It's beyond the scope of the study, so I'm just going to move on. In the next section, we will see, with specific reference to Jiri Prochazka's fights in the UFC, how he builds upon the principles outlined in these books, particularly the first 3, the books of Earth, Water, and Fire. In his UFC debut against Volkan Oezdemir, after a rough first round against what is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated strikers in the division, Prochazka began to find success with his ebb and flow style. The tide of the fight turned when Prochazka surprised Oezdemir with a high kick following a low kick, rocking the former title challenger. Immediately attempting to take back the initiative, Volkan moves forward and Jiri retreats when switching stance in southpaw and cracking the advancing Swiss fighter with a lead right hook. Badly hurt, Volkan retreats and Jiri chases him around the edge of the cage from Ozdemir's left, fakes a flying knee and hits Oezdemir with a long jab and a right cross combination that puts Volkan's lights out, who collapses to the ground like a marionette with strings cut. The finishing sequence is a textbook application of a tactic Musashi encourages specifically in the Book of Fire, which is forcing yourself onto the non-dominant side of the opponent. Approaches from the outside are typically best made from the weaker side. As Oezdemir is an orthodox fighter, Jiri approaches from his left during the sequence to limit the threat of a big counter right. Against Dominic Reyes, a dangerous southpaw counter-striker, Prochazka melded his defensive and positional strategies with his offense. Early in the first round, Jiri is switching stances to southpaw when advancing to create a closed stance matchup, while switching to orthodox when retreating, making an open stance matchup. Open stances typically ensure a greater distance between two opponents and makes front foot position absolutely key to determining who has the most offensively potent angle. By which I mean who basically has the most weapons free and can throw them hard and have a good chance of actually landing on their opponent. Jiri would often subtly shift his left foot to the outside of Reyes' right foot when implementing these stance switch retreats before springing forward with committed punches. Importantly, these punches typically were thrown in combination, taking advantage of Reyes' preference for throwing precision single strike counters. It's worth noting that the switch stance retreat was not without its issues for Jiri, who was hit with several left body kicks by Reyes. A little later in the round, we see Jiri following Reyes with a front kick as the Mexican-American former title challenger attempts to angle out. Here we see another tendency of Jiri's to throw high percentage strikes where his opponent is concerned with moving laterally. By high percentage I mean with a good chance of actually landing. The body provides a larger target than the head and thus often easier to hit, especially when the opponent retreats and isn't well positioned to counter long range offense like front kicks. We also see that Jiri finds a range on a right hand same time counter to Reyes' low kick, something that he came up short on at the very beginning of the round. Given that Jiri's long stance leaves him vulnerable to kicks to his lead leg, this is a effective tactic, usually, not against Pereira, in discouraging these leg attacks. It forces Reyes to think of it as a big gamble, going, this leg kick's here, but I might get knocked out for it. Once again, taking advantage of Reyes' nature as a single layer counter puncher, by which I mean he tends to like to hit with good technique and then reset. Jiri attacks in combination, taking advantage of this nature. Bad wording on my script. While taking advantage of opponents' tendencies is a key part of game planning in general in MMA, it's worth saying. Consideration of the opponent's nature is explicitly encouraged by Musashi in the Book of Water. Jiri Prochazka Reyes, once again utilizing the teachings in the Book of Fire like he did against Volkan, but adapting to the fact that Reyes is a southpaw, he actually approaches from Reyes' right around the edge of the cage as opposed to the left. Early in round 2, Jiri also used deception, another principle that's explicitly outlined in the Book of Fire, to catch Reyes. Dipping into his stance, Reyes expected Jiri to throw an uppercut, as he tends to do in this position. He likes to dip down with his knees bent. It allows him to really drive up into the uppercut, but it also looks like he might be shooting for a takedown. But instead of swinging up the rear hand, this time instead Jiri hits Reyes with a hard jab. He later throws another front kick at Reyes, this time targeting at the left side of Reyes' body, encouraging Reyes to attempt to escape to his right, and so Prochazka walks him into a big left hook. Jiri finishes Reyes with creative offense and pressuring, spinning into a second elbow after having his first blocked and KOing Reyes. If you're wondering, okay, but what about all those times that Reyes hit him? We're going to be looking at defense later. This is just us covering the offensive stuff. In only his third UFC bout, Prochazka challenged for the title against champion Glover Teixeira. Glover largely dominated the first round, although a reversal at the end of the round allowed Jiri to opportunistically belt Glover with vicious, nearly fight-ending ground and pound at the very end of round 1. Round 2, Prochazka that is, used misdirection again effectively as a tactic. After retreating, he looks away to distract Glover before stunning Teixeira with a 1-2. Shortly thereafter, he took advantage of Glover's tendency to dip his head straight down, something which cost the Brazilian in his fights against Rumble Johnson and Alexander Gustafsson, using a jab to get Glover to dip, and then he hits him with a flying knee. Glover pulls his head back to avoid Prochazka's follow-up uppercut, only to get caught with a long 1-2 from Jiri and ensuing combination punches. Once again hurt, Glover desperation wrestles. As the bout with Glover Teixeira is the only fight thus far in Jiri's UFC career where we've seen extended grappling phases, we also saw Prochazka's willingness to chase submissions, showing that he's not only a striker but an offensive fighter in all terrains. Don't get me wrong, he's no Charles Oliveira, but he does attempt to set up an anaconda choke prematurely, which Glover escapes. Jiri, later on in the round again, nails Glover with an uppercut. He's not just doing these things one and done, that worked, I'm going to not do it again. If it's something that he can see that his opponent does a lot of the time, he will take advantage of those tendencies. Later on, he unsuccessfully attempts to interdict a right hook from Glover with a left elbow, which showed an interest in intercepting shots, something which we saw to much greater effect later on against Jamal Hill. Prochazka's effective offense in round 3 was almost entirely derived from misdirection and opportunism. Very early in the round, Jiri intercepts Glover's advance with a knee to the breadbasket before defending a takedown attempt from the Brazilian. Jiri Prochazka effectively utilizes retreating switch counters into a southpaw cross to buzz Glover, and after getting up from attempts from Glover to establish ground control, he drove him to the fence before establishing the clinch and hitting Teixeira with short upcuts and elbows. We then see more use of misdirection, who from southpaw begins hand-fighting Glover's left hand to his right. The reason this is a misdirection is because when hand-fighting from open stance, your opponent typically expects you to be trying to open a pathway to their head, but Prochazka instead surprises Glover by delivering a big left hook to the breadbasket, badly hurting him. Glover dips his head into an up elbow from Jiri and follow-up intensive body work forces Glover onto all fours. Jiri attempts an unorthodox arm triangle from the top, but his lack of finesse allows Glover to reverse the position. Round 4 was another more dominant round by Glover, although another misdirection cross from Jiri did land just after the first minute elapsed, and in round 5, Jiri finishes the fight at the very end after escaping Glover's ground control by managing to sneak in what I initially thought was a DAS, but actually turns out to be a no-hooks rear naked choke to get the victory, his ambitious submission offense finally paying off for him and leaving him the only man to submit Glover Teixeira in the Brazilian legend's MMA career. After a hiatus and vacating the belt due to injury, Prochazka fought Alex Pereira for the vacant light heavyweight strap and came up short. Nevertheless, to a much greater degree than in their second match, Prochazka did have a great deal of success in this fight, winning the first round and hurting Pereira Powhatan not long before he ended up getting overzealous and falling victim to the Brazilian's incredible power. In round 1, Jiri caught Pereira with one of his dipping uppercuts. Whilst no doubt Alex had seen Jiri perform the stack during tape study, his preoccupation with preventing himself from being taken down made him respect Jiri's level change, allowing Prochazka to land his uppercut. While the middle of the round was largely characterized by Pereira effectively punishing Prochazka's low stance with leg kicks, Prochazka did manage to take a page out of the Book of Earth to use other weapons and managed to get a high crotch takedown and convert this into a significant amount of time in top position. Whilst Pereira did a good job minimizing the damage Prochazka could do from here, a few elbows in an extended period of time on top did steal Prochazka a round that he would otherwise have likely lost. In round 2, Jiri slipped to the outside of a committed power jab by Pereira, showing that he did have some degree of head movement even against Alex, and caught Powhatan on the temple with a left hook counter, showing the sort of karate style sudden linear shift counter punching that he later used to great success against Jamal Hill at UFC 311. Shortly after, a right hook off a shift to southpaw caught Alex. Jiri then used that opportunity to retake the initiative, pressuring Alex, who backed up against the fence. A big overhand right landed for the check, rocking Pereira, but not finishing him. Later in the round, Jiri missed a jab, but a following cross catches Pereira on the chin. Jiri switches in southpaw with his right foot past Alex's in a very dominant position, but kind of squanders the opportunity because as he chases Pereira, he gets overzealous and squares up in front of the Brazilian, who drops him with a short left hook. Down but not out, Prochazka attempts a double leg against the fence. Maintaining his balance, Pereira braces himself against the cage, drops hammer fists and elbows onto the side of Jiri's head. Jiri falls backward and the fight is stopped somewhat controversially by referee Mark Goddard. As we know, Prochazka bounced back against Austrian Serb contender Aleksandar Rakic, who put on the performance of his life against Jiri even in a losing effort. Whilst Rakic stymied a lot of Prochazka offense with long straight punches and well-timed leg kicks, Prochazka did manage to opportunistically stun the Serb late in the round, dragging him into a collar tie before rocking him with a short right hook. In round 2, Rakic was again doing very well, but Prochazka was able to find a dipping 1-2 to severely hurt Rakic, enabled by opportunism and pressure. Like a shark smelling blood, Prochazka pours it on and tosses a badly concussed Rakic to the mat before finishing him with ground and pound. The subsequent rematch with Pereira was a really bad night for Jiri, no doubt made more difficult by the short notice timing of the fight and the clear improvements that Pereira had made, giving an answer for almost all of Jiri's actions. Jiri did attempt to discourage the leg kicks with a big hook, to no real success. The rest of the fight was largely a one-sided demolition, with Jiri unable to get any consistent offense off and getting desperate with it. Jiri was dropped with a counter left hook at the very end of the round and was saved by the bell before being knocked out in the first few seconds of round 2 with a head kick and follow-up punches. I'm not going to go into the Jamal Hill fight here because for most of you watching, you're here after UFC 311 and it's still fresh in your memory, and we all know the basic story of that fight, which was that the switch stance slipping and counter-punching won him the fight, Jiri. Also, it isn't uploaded to Fight Pass yet, and I really don't feel like paying the pay-per-view price again or dealing with a clippy Russian stream if I'm going to be doing second-by-second breakdowns essentially. The stats are readily available though, and I will deal with those stats. They are incorporated into the statistical analysis that I do at the end of this video. Now that we have looked over the offensive performances of Jiri Prochazka during his UFC career, we can see that the majority of his success comes from counters, misdirection, pressure, and opportunism. In my opinion, his movement and defensive style allows opportunities to take advantage of these situations that a more traditional sort of hands-up style wouldn't be as fluid and sort of taking advantage of. Now that the offense is taken care of, let's get into the counter narrative that really inspired me to make this video. Is Jiri Prochazka's head defense good actually? Now don't get me wrong, no one would mistake Jiri Prochazka for a Mayweather-esque defensive savant, but the popular narrative around Jiri is that his method of dropping his hands is bad, and that's really to blame for why he's taking a lot of damage in several of his fights. Because, The fact that he's fighting the best light heavyweights in the world apparently doesn't mean that you should expect to take some big shots. But how true really is that? Well, I'm going to look first at examples of Jiri's defensive methods. It is often said about experienced fighters making their UFC debuts that nerves or the awareness of having more people watching you can make combat athletes perform below expectation. In his UFC debut against Volkan Oezdemir, I think Jiri's defense did hold up decently well, but Volkan's combination of forward pressure and long combos of tight, strong hooks did exploit some limitations of any style depending on slipping punches. Any boxing coach will tell you if your opponent is good at head movement, throw more. It's impossible to correctly anticipate every punch, especially if you're doing more than Marvin Vettori was doing in his rematch against Adesanya, just going 1-2, 1-2, 1-2 over and over again. Early in round 1, we see Jiri parrying a jab from Oezdemir, as well as leaning back from an advancing Volkan to intercept the Swiss with a hard lead uppercut. Whilst mid-pressure, Jiri weaves and triangle steps backwards to avoid offense from Oezdemir, which is mostly punches. We do also have a little bit of a meme moment of Jiri catching an Oezdemir jab on the top of his head admittedly, but hey, better than taking it on the chin. Reyes posed a very different challenge from Volkan. As I said before, Reyes is southpaw. He's a single-layer counter-striker. This means he can be driven backwards by sustained offense, even though he is generally very textbook and mechanically correct in terms of the counters that he does throw. And if he misses his strikes, though, he can be open, as he found out to devastating effect against Jan Blachowicz. When Jiri was fighting Reyes, the Czech fighter early began to play with Reyes' perception of distance through constant shifting of stances. Aware of how dangerous Reyes can be when he's figured out the perfect range on his strikes, he tried to make it as difficult as possible for Reyes to actually figure out what that range was. As I mentioned earlier, he would pick his timing to suddenly close distance and pressure Reyes with combinations. Around the halfway point of round 1, Reyes did take Jiri down, but Jiri showed good awareness from bottom position, exploding up and out of underneath him by timing his escape with Reyes' attempt to pass the mount. So when Reyes' mass wasn't fully weighing down on him, he suddenly pushed off. That's the best time to do it if you're stuck in that situation. When Reyes would fire a big left straight, Prochazka would simply step back into open stance before re-engaging, utilizing footwork as his defense while keeping his hands free to attack. In the second round, Reyes started experimenting himself with shifting offense, interestingly enough. Jiri used outstretched arms to block/parry a shifting cross, hook combo from Reyes, and then triangle steps and pulls his head back to avoid an incoming left cross and a left hook from an orthodox shift from Reyes. Not long after, he blocks a high kick from Reyes and counters another low kick with a huge right cross. That cross I was telling you about, he likes to do that to discourage low kicks. This one actually landed, and it landed heavy. As Jiri was pressuring, Reyes, always an accurate puncher, did manage to land a big pull counter on Prochazka that hurt him. The following sequence, Jiri attempts to take down out of desperation, is unable to get it, but Reyes threatens a guillotine and sits down on it. Despite being rocked seconds before, Prochazka actually shows enough awareness to shift his head slightly to prevent the choke from working, and rather than trying to force his way out, he simply lets Dominic Reyes burn his arms out trying to finish it. Jiri does move into the top of Reyes' half guard and is seemingly KO'd by an up kick, but Herb Dean doesn't notice. Prochazka instantly wakes up and keeps fighting, and soon afterwards Reyes would get up, Prochazka would follow him up and finish him with the spinning elbow. Against Glover Teixeira, another strong short-range combination puncher like Volkan Oezdemir, but with the added benefit of great offensive wrestling and a deadly submission game mixed in, Prochazka's defensive system was not entirely without success, but it was mixed. Glover is a really hard person to not get hit by, unless you have an 84-inch reach and you're just stretching it out the whole time. But it was really Prochazka's defense on the ground that shined against the best grappler in the light heavyweight division of the post-Jones DC period, in my opinion. Midway through the first round, Glover threatened a rear naked choke, but Jiri turned his head into Glover's elbow to reduce the pressure. Again, awareness. It's these little things that can make big differences to the outcome of the fight, especially in submission situations. Shortly after, Glover did manage to establish side control, and Jiri used his legs to push off the cage and change his position to a north-south. While still a disadvantageous position from a control point of view, and frankly pretty comedic to look at, it does hide his head away from damage. This shows a degree of awareness not only of position, but also of his environment. Late in the round, Jiri escaped an armbar threat. His defense on the ground was also on display in round 4, where he waited out an arm triangle attempt from Mount. About half a minute later, Glover locked in a textbook perfect arm triangle. I remember watching this live thinking this fight is over. Jiri managed to shift his hips out the side before rolling out of the submission. Near the end of the round, Glover took Prochazka's back. Jiri managed to shift slightly to ensure that Glover started to slide off of the side, and Jiri made sure that his legs and his hips were driving into the ground, preventing Teixeira from locking on a body triangle as he was slipping off. In the final round, Prochazka's come from behind submission victory was actually enabled by once again pushing off of the fence with his legs to reverse a Teixeira who was in mount. The ending sequence of that fight occurred after Glover rolled to escape Jiri's attempt to establish a crucifix. Whilst Glover's on his hands and knees, Jiri sneaks an arm under the chin and wins via a no-hooks rear naked choke. Not only did Prochazka's ground defense prevent himself from getting submitted by Teixeira, but it actually put him in a position to himself win a victory over a high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner, and do it by sub no less. Prochazka's striking defense against Glover was also far from completely ineffective. While there are, of course, dramatic periods of the fight where Jiri was hurt, most infamously in this final round before Glover pulled guard, Jiri's defense on the feet was far from non-existent. In the first round, we see Jiri rolling a right cross from Glover off the left shoulder. Whilst the shoulder roll TM is often thought of in the context of fighters like Floyd Mayweather and Dustin Poirier, where it's associated with tight guard systems, we do sometimes see Jiri rolling punches off his shoulders. It just looks like a sort of shrug while his arms are fully outstretched. This is still a shoulder roll. It's still not, the punch is still not connecting in the way that the thrower wants it to. So even though it doesn't look as pretty, as cool maybe as a Floyd Mayweather shoulder roll, or even a Dustin Poirier one, it's still worth having, and still worth doing. So in the second round, Jiri also slips under a left hook from Glover before circling to the center of the cage, showing some awareness of the space, and using head movement to get out of the way despite not having his hands up. Jiri also once again used a shift from southpaw to orthodox, and even briefly put his right hand up to defend in case of a long left hook that never comes. So, there's 15 seconds in his career where he does have his hands up. Jiri hand fights from open stance as well, make sure to do some sort of manipulation of stance there, and uses head movement again to evade a 1-2 by Glover. Round 4 also sees effective head movement from Jiri, rolling with 2 punches of an uncharacteristically fast blitz from Glover in the beginning of the round, which was a moment that really stuck out to me because I did not expect Glover to be able to move that fast, especially not at round 4 in a very, very high-paced fight. The first fight with Pereira, by virtue of Jiri getting finished, was obviously not his most outstanding defensive performance. But this video isn't here to convince you that his leg defense was great. Instead, what I'm trying to get at is that Jiri's head defense is actually pretty effective, or at least sort of relatively on par with a lot of people that do block, contrary to the prevailing narrative in the sport right now. Again, in the first round, Prochazka shows effective sub-defense as Pereira clamps on a tight-standing guillotine choke when Jiri's trying to take him down against the fence. Jiri ensures that not all of this pressure is actually choking him and manages to wait out the guillotine attempt. He also showed good head movement in the second round. There's going to be multiple examples of such that you can look up yourself if you don't believe me. Against Rakic, whilst Prochazka did get hit quite a lot, he also evaded a great deal of the head strikes thrown by an uncharacteristically active Alexander Rakic. Early in round 1, Jiri slips a fast jab, a big right hook, and switches stances to avoid a 1-2. Whilst crashing the pocket, Jiri ducks under a left hook from Alexander, but is hit with a back fist and a cross. How often do you see back fist thrown after a left hook though? I mean, aside from Brown versus Arlovski, no other examples really jump to my mind right now. Soon after, Jiri switches to southpaw and pulls his head away from across from the rangy Rakic, and Jiri even manages to avoid a low kick, simply stepping back to avoid it. Don't get me wrong, he did get kicked in the legs a hell of a lot on this fight. Nevertheless, again, he gets hit with a calf kick very shortly afterwards, which actually makes him sit down to a stance, so he definitely didn't like the feeling of that one. Jiri stepped forward into southpaw, avoiding a Rakic right cross, which glanced off his shoulder. He also leans back to avoid a Rakic cross a little later, dips out a range of more Rakic punches and switches southpaw. After taking some leg kicks, Jiri pulls his head away from a Rakic uppercut. Rakic also misses a leg kick as Jiri pulls his leg back. And Jiri even pulls out a range of one of Rakic's right hooks and has his glove up by his chin. Pulls back from more hooks, After Rakic is hit by Prochazka's right hook and begins firing back really hard, Jiri catches a right hook from the serve on his shoulder. And in the second round, we'll see Jiri outside slip a Rakic cross and pull out a range of a really, really fast, really dangerous Rakic hook. Jiri also rolled a Rakic right cross. Basically, despite getting hit a lot in this fight, he did start doing better defensively in the second round, in my opinion, at least as a ratio of the amount of offense that Rakic was throwing out, and was really able to time his strikes well to make them count. He, finished Rakic in the second round, as we've already gone over. Defensive successes for Prochazka in his second fight with Powhatan were limited, but not altogether non-existent. After switching into a jab and pressuring Pereira, Jiri did pull his head back from a lead hook in the first round. Late in that same round, he would also shoulder roll a high kick from Pereira and slip a big right hook. I can practically hear it now, but Josh, you're cherry picking good defensive sequences and ignoring all the times Jiri gets hit in the face. Well, look, aside from the fact it would be incredibly uninteresting to go through every single sequence on this video of his entire career in the UFC, I did feel the need to point out plenty of examples of effective defense. So if I bored you going, oh, then he did this, then he did this, then he did this, I'm sorry, but when I'm going against a counter narrative, I have to actually provide an evidential base for that. Hopefully the number of examples that I use help to convince you. You'll see a whole bunch of those listed out on the video. Just so you know, the timestamps are going to represent how much time is left in the round. So basically, if you go on UFC Fight Pass, if something says there's 2:42, that means there's 2 minutes and 42 seconds left in the round. It's going to show 2:42 on the UFC timer, just to make it easier for you guys. If you don't believe me, or if you want to go look this up for yourself. If not, if I didn't convince you, here's some numbers that are required from UFC stats. Of 594 head strikes thrown at Prochazka in his UFC career, and this is including the Hill fight, 298 landed. That's a rate of 50%, which is kind of high. But this also takes into account ground strikes from Glover in their fight. Not every single strike that Glover threw on the ground was to Jiri's head, but the vast majority were. So for the ease of the math, I'm going to count them as head strikes. When excluding the ground strikes from that fight to get a rough idea of the actual numbers of strike defense on the feet, which is what I'm really trying to get at, we get a head defense stat of 55%, so that's only 45% landing on Jiri. That is sort of roughly the same ballpark as many other top-level fighters that are facing top-level competition. Again, the numbers are going to be a little bit higher than many other champion-caliber UFC fighters. That's because basically he went so fast to the title, as opposed to having to go through a bunch of guys that were relatively low level before finally getting to guys that are really high level. Like I said, I'm not trying to say he's the best defensive fighter in the UFC. I'm not trying to say that if you're training yourself, you shouldn't put your hands up. I'm just trying to push back against this overly simplistic narrative that I feel is really sort of got in here, that Jiri has no defense. And then when they see him not putting his hands up and beating Hill, they don't go, oh no, maybe we were wrong about that. They go, oh, well, he's changed. And even though he has polished things up a little bit, I don't think that there is a overall fundamental change. His league defense obviously still leaves a great deal to be desired. And as much as I really like Jiri and I was rooting for him and I picked him to win that fight and he did, definitely I think it was helped by the fact that Hill doesn't really throw leg kicks. I know this video isn't perfect. Please bear with me. It's my first YouTube video ever, and for those of you who made it this far, I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. Before I go, I want to encourage you all to check out, if you haven't already, a couple of podcasts I like to listen to. They're going to be listed on screen. If the algorithm has sent you to me, you're likely already aware of a lot of these. You're probably a complete degenerate, but in case you aren't, they're really worth your time. Also, especially shout out to Vampiric Legs. He's another MMA YouTuber, and he was talking to me and giving me a little bit of help in terms of, what softwares to use and a little bit of tips here and there. So thanks, man. Wanted to shout him out. Also, one last thing, not all of my videos are going to be this long, nor is focus on sort of individual exchanges, listing things. I just felt the need to do that with this one because I'm doing pushback against the prevailing narrative. So I figured I had to come correct with some facts and figures. I had to have some proof. I hope it didn't bore you. And thanks for listening this far. I really appreciate it. This is Josh, out.